Okay, everybody, thanks for coming back to the Xanadu Review. My name is Professor John Anders, but as always, you can just call me PJ. Well, today with me I have Catherine D of the Default Friends Substack and Twitter account. I guess it's X now. And Catherine's a really interesting writer who does everything from like tech to culture. But Catherine, I'll throw it to you. And for any of my audience who aren't aware of you, I think probably a good chunk are, but you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, your type of writing, all that kind of thing?
Yeah, I write about internet culture, but I started off my writing career under this name at least, stoking the flames of the culture war. So I dip my toes into different topics. It's usually anchored in the internet, but I do some media theory and some more traditional tech reporting. I've done a lot of like medical reporting somehow. Every time I've written for the Free Press, which is Bari Weiss's website, for some reason I do like a investigative journalism about healthcare. But yeah, I'm sort of a jack of all spades, master of none
Yeah,
type figure.
kind of a renaissance woman in that way, which is kind of what I like about your writing. It's always something a little bit different because there's some people like if you read their work you kind of know what you're going to get, but with you it's a little bit something different every time, which is kind of what I like. uh,
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I appreciate that.
yeah, no problem. So I guess I originally kind of discovered you a while back when you were writing about internet culture and like culture more broadly. It was an article you wrote called "Lesbians Who Only Date Men," and kind of dug into some kind of partially like the LGBT culture, but specifically in the kind of the space of the internet. And it made me kind of wonder about you since I've read some other stuff you've done, listened to some other podcasts, and you talk about being online from a very young age, which I think is maybe I think we're probably roughly the same age. Probably one of the first ones to kind of grow up with the internet if we were earlier adopters. And I'm wondering like what was your internet heritage was like, I guess you could say. Because for me, like I got on probably way too young, like 2004 or something like that, and random forums that people would keep up and stuff like that. And this was before Facebook, MySpace, like the early days of 4chan and stuff like that. And I kind of tapped out very early 2010s on that one. But I'm curious what it was like for you, since it as you could probably speak to, like the pre and post social media internet were different, very, very different spaces.
Yeah, they were. So I've been in front of a computer since I was very little, like a toddler. Um, and I started using the internet alone probably around 7. But earlier I would play dress up games with my mom. So these are like virtual paper dolls. And we would play, and I'm now that I'm thinking back at it, I don't know how my mom knew these existed. She might have just Googled like doll games or something, or I guess not even Googled. So this was the late 90s. So she must have
Mhm.
searched on Alta Vista or something, which is like crazy to think about. So we would play kiss games. And this was a particular style of dress-up games that came from Japan. So there would be anime women, and you would drag different outfits on them. And that was one of the first things I did online. And it was always with my mom. Um, and I remember the computer for some reason was in my little sister's nursery. Um, and prior to that, it was in the basement. Um, and then, so around like 7, I started using the internet alone. I played games like these Japanese dress up games, and dolls, DOLLZ, which is a very similar sort of thing. They came out of these avatars for a website called The Palace, and people just really liked them. And they're still sort of a nostalgic thing. You people listening are probably familiar with them. They're like there's different styles of them in the early 2000s, and late 90s, the two like big styles were the like a prep and then a goth with like white makeup, and there was like a punk one, and then there was like different styles in terms of like format of the dolls. So there's like sprites were one of them, were really little. There's a kind that sort of had like a more urban look. There's like a dozen different formats of these. And I was like surfing web rings, and I played Yahoo games and was in Yahoo chat rooms and AOL chat rooms. One memory that I was actually just talking about today on another show that really stands out in my mind, in my internet usage history, is I used to love to search things. Like one thing I would do a lot is I'd listen to college radio, like in elementary school, and this is how I discovered Coast to Coast AM, which I'm also a very big fan of, and They Might Be Giants. And I would like love searching things, and I was using Yahoo a lot. And one day my dad came home and he was like, we're not going to use Yahoo anymore. There's this new thing called Google. And that like really stands out to me as like a very formative memory. I did a lot of role playing. I was big on The Sims Online, which came out in 2002, and then I migrated to Second Life. I was on MSN Messenger. I wasn't allowed to have a MySpace, so that was pretty touch and go. I was in tons of different forums. It was probably going on a bit longer than you had hoped.
No, go for it.
Yeah,
it's definitely interesting.
Yeah, I loved all sorts of like internet ephemera too. I was like real into Time Cube, and like maybe he's on to something, and things like this. As I'm talking, I'm just like remembering of all the different ways. At the time, the internet interacted with older forms of media. So you'd see something on TV and it would be like so easy to like look it up or like connect to it or like fall further down the rabbit hole. Like another really formative memory for me is at some point we moved the desktop computer into my bedroom. And it was like this big privilege. And my parents were like, we're trusting you with this. And I also had a TV, and this was like, this is like the elementary school equivalent of having a car, right?
Yeah.
And I didn't abuse their trust outside of staying up too late. I wasn't doing anything untoward or weird. But I remember like 2 or 3 a.m. or something, like some crazy late time, on public access, there was this preacher, this really crazy preacher, and he he hated Jews, he hated Mormons, he hated everyone. And again, it's like you can't imagine that existing today on television, right? Like and it was so interesting to me because this is the same time that the progressive media is satirizing and in some cases we're rightfully fearful of the religious right, and it was like the start of new atheism. And I'd like watch him. I was just so fascinated by Christians because they were so maligned in the media. And I remember I would watch this guy on public access, and I would email him, and he would respond to my emails on TV. And I would keep emailing him. And of course, there's a little bit of a lag, right? It wasn't like, it wasn't like instant messaging. It was, he would go for hours and hours and hours. And every now and then when he would read the emails, he would say something, he would read mine. And I remember one time I was like, well, I understand why you hate Jews, but why do you hate Mormons so much? Aren't they Christian? And he is so mad. He's like, no, they're not Christian. They're heretics, this and that. But yeah, I mean, and then we get Facebook. I mean, I'm skipping over a bunch of stuff, but at the risk of monologuing too much, I mean, we get Facebook. I'm a super early adopter of Facebook, early adopter to Twitter, although I really started going hard in the paint with Twitter around 2015. Is when my like Twitter career like really starts in earnest. But I was like in the Tila Tequila fandom in 2007, 2008. I early adopter to Instagram, early adopter to Vine. It was touch and go with Musically, and then I got into it once it was TikTok. So I mean, I've been around. Some things I wasn't too interested in, or like was a late adopter to. I was never on Something Awful. I was a late adopter to 4chan. I was interested in other image boards, but 4chan didn't really do anything for me. I loved YouTube, but I never got into like Twitch or big YouTube streamers. I don't know much about like BreadTube, for instance, or any of like the drama channels.
Probably for the
But
best.
yeah, and I think I think that's I could go down numerous rabbit holes, but I'm sure I've been monologuing now for like 10 minutes or something, so I'll let us
No,
move
it's
on.
no, it's a lot to work with, and there's the couple things that really strike me is, first of all, I mean, it's such a surreal experience, like live emailing this pastor, like this crazy public access guy. It feels like it's almost like live stream like that, because you have
Yeah,
that direct feedback.
and that's the thing I really liked about radio too. That I was always too scared to call in, but I love I mean I love call-in shows, whether it's sex and therapy, or or relationship issues, or of course like paranormal stories, which is gets back to my love for Coast to Coast AM and eventually Midnight in the Desert.
Yeah. Well, it's very because with all these things too, it makes me think of like this very the internet, and I think you wrote about this recently. Like the internet is a liminal space between reality and the physical world and the mind. Since you were the one, I feel like I maybe like heard Coast to Coast here or there, but then you writing about it made me want to listen to it. And there's just hundreds of hours of it on YouTube. And it's something that, again, it feels, because it's not really that long ago. It's from the 90s, but it feels so much older and so much different because of that. It feels like maybe the quality of person, or even like, probably a lot of these people are still alive. And the fact that you actually have to talk to somebody, I don't know, it feels like people think things out more. And I don't, there's something about it that's just kind of intangible that I feel like maybe more and more is being lost, since, I was, again, kind of similar to you, an early adopter with a lot of this stuff. And a lot of this, for better or for worse, like I would get tired of it pretty quickly. Like I found, it was, high school or something. Somebody showed me 4chan. It was the the mid 2000s. And I got tired of it. It's like, I kind of get the idea of this. And, like quit in like 2010 or something like that. And I haven't really gone back. But I feel like there's like, you're always chasing the high of a new platform, like a new community that has some kind of energy to it. But maybe there's something a little bit more perennial about radio. So I'm curious to like what drew you to it. Is it just the weirdness and the paranormal, or is it just like the specificity of how you interact with people?
Um, so I've had moments of really loving radio. I think a big part of it is I would listen to the radio at night. I'm one of these people who sort of always needs to be interacting with media. And that's why I'm kind of cranky when you get these like Gen Z cultural critics who say like, well, we were the first generation that, whatever. And it's like, well, what about
Mm-hmm.
TV? Like what about the people who are on the internet before you? Because like I have a lot of features of an iPad kid. I'm very I've had to like train myself out of some of it, but I feel like a kinship with that sort of upbringing. But there's older media forms. So I listened to the radio as a kid, but I really liked paranormal stuff and ghosts. I mean, I've loved like the occult since I was like a little kid. I spent the first few years of my life in New England, and I lived near like a colonial cemetery, and I would take walks with my mom, and I would call it a ghost garden. And I was just like so fascinated by the idea of like the spirit world and fairies. And I'm sure, you know, a lot of this, it has to do with my parents, but like, you know, in the 90s, media was very focused on the paranormal.
Hmm.
The X-Files was big, right? There's Unsolved Mysteries. I mean, the list goes on and on.
Hmm.
And when I was a kid, and I don't remember when exactly, but I got this little, this is pre iPods, because I eventually replaced listening to the radio with an iPod, or even like another like a proto iPod, like another MP3 player. But
Hmm.
anyway, so I get this little radio, and um, it must have been like syndicated on like a college radio station or something. Like during the day, for some reason, an episode of Coast to Coast was playing, and it was just so like funky and weird. And there was a time traveler who had called in, and I looked it up, and I just became obsessed with it, and I would listen to it streaming on the internet. So I wouldn't always listen to it on the radio, listen to it online. Um, and it's less the medium and more the content for me. Which I think like sometimes it confuses people, because I'm not super into like government conspiracy stuff, or even like UFOs. But I love everything else. Like I love all the other stories. Certain like stories from like experiencers. But you know, like the astral projection and remote viewing, and that kind of thing is really my bread and butter. Ghost stories, of course. And I still like fall asleep every night, and this has been going on for decades, listening to ghost stories, and they still scare me.
Hmm. It kind of makes me think of, are you familiar with the work of Jacques Vallée?
Of course.
Yeah. So that's kind of what it makes me think of too. And I think I had a very similar experience. And you forgot the most important 90s supernatural OG, which is the resurgence of Scooby-Doo. But, you know, we can move past that. That's okay. But, um, but no, I joke, but it was something even at the time that you know, made me interested in that from an early age as well. But you know, for the listeners who aren't aware, Jacques Vallée is a, what you call him, philosopher, a, you know, theoretician. I don't know what you would call him, but his basic premise is that aliens, demons, fairies, these are all describing a phenomenon that exists, and people's minds will kind of make a shortcut. Like, you know, if you had lived in medieval England, you couldn't conceptualize the experience that you're having, so you would fill it in with something culturally specific, like an angel or a fairy. And today's modern world, it would be, you know, the more technological explanation being an alien or something like that. And it is humanity's minds trying to make sense of something that they're not really equipped to make sense of. And that's something that I find really interesting. I've been thinking a lot about lately, since kind of the same, I don't know if you you know, you're aware of like the creepy pasta genre, that people will just write weird kind of creepy stories and post them anonymously on like Reddit or 4chan or different sites like that. And that's kind of what made me how I came in contact with some of this stuff too, because I'll listen to a lot of these different stories. Like, same thing, my wife, she was kind of making fun of me. She's like, you know, you fell asleep, had your phone blaring, you're listening to some like story about a skinwalker eating somebody, and you look so peaceful. And but there is something that is like strangely calming about these stories, at least to me. So I'm curious what draws you to that. But just as a little bit more framing, like the other interesting one that I found is like you're talking about like remote viewing. And just this morning, funnily enough, I was reading up about that like the CIA released something like, yeah, we did some studying for this. And essentially my understanding was, they're like, okay, this is something, the ESP or remote viewing is statistically like, it's more than like, you know, more than guessing, but it's also not um accurate enough to rely on. So just little things like that, or you know, the concept of like, you know, viewing particles will, if they're observed, it'll change how they behave. So there's something there that, at least for me, for the longest time, you mentioned the new atheism thing, because that was me for a really long time. Because I grew up in that, very religious background, went very hard against it with the new atheism thing. But then kind of loop back around to, ironically enough, some of these like creepypastas and stuff like that. Like, okay, there is something else there, and how we describe it, it could be religious, it could be the paranormal. You could use, science to explain it, but there's something there that I think draws a lot of people in.
I think there's something there too. I struggle with religion. Um, and I almost wish that I grew up in a religious household, because I feel like I have this sort of impulse or attraction to it, but I don't really um, I don't really know what I believe. And I think that's part of my draw to it. Because it feels, for someone who is, and please excuse the cliche, who's like spiritual but not religious, I feel like, by no fault of my own, it is it the next best thing is the paranormal, and the esotericism and the occult, because you feel it's like you have a vibe, but it's like, I wasn't introduced to religious ideas either like early enough or like stringently enough or something, and so it doesn't like stick. Like I have this like this like questioning impulse of like, like, why, wait, like, are you sure, it just like it
Mhm.
doesn't totally land with me for some reason. And I've never actually said that, because I've been in sort of, never said that in public, at least, because I write in sort of like these heterodox right-leaning publications, and I think that like this is maybe like a little frowned upon. But it's like I have like moments of like, well, maybe Christianity, or maybe Judaism, or and for a while I was Wiccan, but like the alternative history aspect of Wicca really turned me off, and I can't commit to it. And then as far as Christianity, I was baptized Catholic. My mom is Catholic, and I first communion. I was confirmed. I taught Sunday school even, but it just like wasn't. I don't know. I just feel like it wasn't like strong enough in my home or something, or like I didn't go to mass, and like I wasn't properly like brought into the faith at the right age. It was always I've sort of grew up with this philosophy that like, just believe what is right in your heart or something, and so that made me confused. It's like I have an instinct, but it's like can't really commit to any one path, because I'm like always kind of looking over here, um and I can't like there's moments where I feel very drawn to Catholicism. Like I'll say, Hail Marys when I'm like very, very sad, or, if I feel like I need some kind of support. But then it's like the minute someone mentions witchcraft, I'm like kind of like looking over like, well, maybe if I burn this sweet grass, it'll invite a, benevolent spirit into my home, or, whatever thing. Maybe the
Mhm.
veil is thinner on Beltane. Who knows?
Sure. Well, I think that's kind of, at least to me, what's interesting about the occult and spirituality, and having get kind of like you have a more open mind to, where I was raised very religiously. My dad was a pastor. My great grandpa was a pastor, like a very religious family. So I think I went really hard in the other direction for a while. But interestingly enough, I'm reading a book right now by a historian called Tom Holland, called Dominion, and he's basically talking about the history of Christianity, and to a lesser degree like Judaism and Islam, and how they kind of all weave into each other. But the interesting thing, when you're talking about burning sage, about how Catholicism in a lot of ways, especially in the early days, were like a way to bring in the pagan traditions of like Rome and Greece, and like the original like Jewish diaspora who converted to Christianity. And that's like the idea of kind of like what the Catholic Church is. And, maybe people get mad at me for saying that, but to me, I find that more interesting, and that's made me more open to religion, is seeing it as humanity's way of interpreting spirituality or the divine or something else. which I don't know. And this may be going off the rails of what I thought I was going to talk about, but that's just kind of the conclusion I've come to it, that much in the same way that, like, Jacques Vallée talks about an alien and a fairy being describing the same experience. Maybe there's something to that as well. And I think not everybody likes that or can handle it, or is like even, conceptually able to, just because of like, however they were raised. Because much in the same way, like, it sounds like you were maybe not into it enough, or whatever, your family that is. And like, mine was just, it was too much. I think you have to have like the right introduction to these things to be able to actually internalize them.
I think so too. And when I was, I think, like 11 or 12, I bought this book on Wicca, and I actually learned about Wicca through Scooby-Doo.
Hex
What they
girls.
have yeah. Although they say Wickham with an M in that movie
Oh
for some reason.
yeah.
Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But so I watched that movie. I was like, well, that's cool. And I'd been to Salem and stuff. And so I buy this book called Teen Witch by Silver Ravenwolf. And in the intro to that
Great
book,
name.
yeah, she says, religions are like, it's like a diamond, and each religion is a different face of that diamond. And so, but it's all trying to refract the same source. And I think that's a theosophical idea, maybe, or like a capital T traditionalist idea. And the book was kind of BS, right? Again, there's this sort of like fabricated history. It's a fun story, but there's this fabricated history that is integral to Wicca. But I always really liked that analogy. And I like that, the idea of there being this sort of like, perennial truth, right, that we interpret in different ways. And I think that's kind of where we're heading back to, as a culture. I think like we were too sort of like relativist for a while, but there's something like that, like that's a good halfway point. Like, there's a clear right and wrong, and there's something that is true, but it's just expressed based on the cultural context.
Yeah. Well, I would agree as well, because I think it's this weird kind of space in culture and history, like with culture and religion, where I think you hit the nail on the head. It was too, especially in like the, in 60s and 70s, like that baby boomer era of like, hey man, if it feels good, just do it, which, made sense in that cultural context. But especially reading a lot of the like the new age stuff, because I've read a lot of this just because I'm interested in it. It's operating under the assumption that like you're living in this era of peace and plenty and relative social stability that just doesn't exist anymore. And I think and again, this is stuff that I read into, like the branches of Christianity or Judaism, even, that are more pluralistic and relativistic, are largely on the decline, and the ones that are growing are ones that are more conservative in particular. So that's the thing that I find interesting / struggle with, is being somebody who's interested in this. Like, I've read a lot about the different histories of like, the three major Abrahamic religions, or occultism. You mentioned theosophy, like Madame Blavatsky, and like this like 18th and 19th century European mysticism. A lot of it is really interesting, but I feel like there is, and we both mentioned that like these culturally specific times that these things exist in, that like, we're entering a kind of like weird and kind of uncertain time, that I feel like, hey man, if it feels good, do it. It's all, all religions are the same, doesn't really draw people in, because I think there is something there, that there is, a divinity, something greater than ourselves, whatever you want to call it. But something that's not just like completely universal to the point where it kind of has no meaning, doesn't really hold water anymore, nor does like the super hyper specific how do I want to put it, religion or whatever it is that is too exclusive, because that doesn't really work in a the hyper connected world that we live in anymore.
Yeah, I the, what's interesting is I feel like in all moments of like, do whatever feels right, people go searching for structure, and it always like manifests in sort of strange ways. Because like as you were talking about like the hippies, UFO cults start rising to prominence around the same time. And those were like weirdly structured, or like Hare Krishnas, like that's weirdly structured. I think like we don't want too much freedom. We want some freedom, but whenever in a way, this is again like somewhat cliche, like in a way like cancel culture or wokeness or whatever you want to call it is also sort of an expression of this, like be who you want. But then we have like let's impose like very strict social rules that are kind of always shifting.
Yeah.
But like one thing that like is I think about maybe like weirdly often, I don't know why this pops in my head a lot, but like whenever anyone mentions hippies, I think of like like Heaven's Gate started in the early 70s. Like there's something about that where it's like I don't know, there's like something that just seems like a really like telling feature of that time.
Yeah, well, I think at least with the hippies, to me, because again, everything I know of that time period, it was very like, especially in the context of the Cold War and everybody, that generation was raised to think like, doing these drills under their desks and everything. They're going to get nuked by the Russians or whatever. It felt like it was almost very apocalyptic in a way. And then when that apocalypse didn't happen, I think a lot of people just like, whatever, and they went on with their life. But the true believers for those, when you talk about Heaven's Gate, or some of these, a lot of, or like the Mansons, you have to deal with the fact that the apocalypse isn't happening, and then you have to kind of square that circle in your mind, and it takes you some really weird places, which I feel like, be it, sorry, go ahead.
You insist that it already is happening and it's like somehow symbolic, like in the case of like the Manson family, like they sort of like strong armed their way into like an interpretation, right? And then like Heaven's Gate, they said that like they were killed through people's perception of them, and then like symbolically resurrected. So I feel like it's not even just like denial, it's sort of like doing these really strange mental acrobatics to justify why the apocalypse did happen, actually.
Yeah. Well, with all these things, it feels like it's dealing with, the anxiety of the time. And again, I'm reading this book about the history of Christianity. And like there was multiple different times they thought there was going to be, at the 1,000 year mark, or all these different signifiers. They're like these weird apocalyptic cults. And again, like over and over again, you would see like people dealing with the fact that the apocalypse didn't happen, but it's all like the specific fears of their time, be it like 1,000 years since the death of Christ / resurrection. And that was, some people thought it was going to be when the world ended, or the encroachment of the Muslim world, different things like that. And it makes me think, again, looping back to modernity and like a lot of so I'm obviously not the first to point out, sociologists have said that it was a way of people dealing with the anxiety around the Cold War. It was like the UFOs, and some of the weird stuff we're seeing now, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this, of like the impending, AI apocalypse, so to speak. Man, I'm wondering what your thoughts are, and just because I'm still like, to me, it's a flip of a coin if it's something that's overhyped, or if this is like a paradigm shift, orders of magnitude that we haven't seen since maybe, industrial revolution, printing press, what have you. But it is, because I remember something you wrote about recently was talking about the people who fall in love with AI, specifically talking about women who fall in love with AI. And it made me think of, again, in this medieval period, there is a woman named Saint Catherine who felt that she was married to Christ, and she would have visions of him. And she thought that she was married to him and in love with him. And it's a little grotesque. It was like, oh, Christ's foreskin was our wedding ring. And it
Ooh.
kind of makes me think about, yeah, it was medieval times. And, it sounded like, I don't want to diagnose people in the past, but probably had like some mental issues, like she would barely eat, maybe anorexic or something like that as well. Neither here nor there. But it feels like we're seeing that more and more, because it feels like a lot of people, we don't know how we're going to deal with this. And it feels like, because to me at least, I wrote that guest piece for you on I have no mouth and I must scream. And sometimes it feels like when I hear these tech leaders talking about what AI could be, it almost is like getting rid of responsibility for like everything it talks about. Oh, they could take over the power grid, they could take over nukes. Like these are things that already exist, but it's like diffusing responsibility to like a god or a devil. So I don't know, I kind of threw a lot at you there, but what are your thoughts on like the apocalyptic nature of AI and how people are dealing with it, and all that type of thing?
It's so something that I was thinking about today was in the 2010, and this is a much smaller scale, but in the 2010s, you were really like confessional essays were really big, and you were really encouraged to push the envelope as a way to get viral fame. Um, there was Vice that was really pushing the envelope, and American Apparel. And then, of course, all of these websites, Exo Jane, Jezebel. And then, like, right as people kind of figured out the formula and were building careers on the backs of strip mining their most embarrassing personal stories or whatever, um, our social codes sort of changed, and cancel culture went nationwide. And I was thinking today, like, it's like so unfair in a way. There's all these millennials who are like kind of conditioned to, like say weird shit, very like, racial slurs online and all sorts of weird crap in an effort to be funny or to stand out. And then like a flip switched, and like suddenly like that stuff could be used and weaponized against you. So it seems unrelated, but I swear I'm getting to a point about AI. And so I was thinking like there's something similar sort of happening now where everyone wants to be a content creator. And I know so many people who have like quit their corporate jobs to pursue content creation. And everyone thinks that they're going to be successful at it. And, a few certainly are, and a few may continue to be, but AI is clearly going to shake that up. I mean, there's also a parallel. Everyone was told to learn to code, and there's something's going to flip. And the thing that I'm curious about is, are all of these people going to be put out of work and lose their sense of like their locus of meaning and importance and self-worth? Because I think a lot of people gain a lot from being internet personalities at whatever scale. Or do we have some kind of immune system where things are going to reshuffle, so like content creators can keep being content creators, and other jobs can people can stay in other lines of work, right? And of course I think of it through the lens of content creation, because that's what I do. And I'm thinking, like, is it going to just be more grounded in physical space to somehow like create guardrails so people could still be successful, and like they turn into small businesses that are servicing like specific geographies? I mean, we're sort of already there, right? There's very few people who are like globally famous, but is it going to become more pronounced somehow? And then how is that going to translate, if that indeed is what happens? How would that translate to other professions? So very long way of saying everything can become shit, or will somehow become more like local, or like it, will start like shrink. Like there'll be some sort of like degrowth thing going on as a way to protect ourselves from the influx of AI. But I'm not really sure which way it'll go.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, myself included, are feeling that uncertainty, anxiety right now. At least for me, because I work in the tech industry as well, and it was, again, like you said, the funny thing. I'm not a coder. I do more infrastructure stuff. It's like, okay, this is the safe job, but maybe now it will be, maybe it won't be. It's so hard to tell to what degree it's overhyped, because it's a weird thing where I've heard it described like usually there are like fringe internet weirdos who are like this next technology, that's how they're going to take us all out, and all the people in charge of it's probably fine, but the rules have reversed in this case, which to me in some ways makes me inherently a little bit more suspicious, since none of it is really profitable so far yet. But I suppose that's neither here nor there. But to your point of the localization, I do wonder, because I was listening to I don't know if you follow Angela Nagel at all. She had this gentleman on her podcast called Lewis Elton today. And he was talking about the resurgence of artisanal creations that are becoming bigger and bigger, in the context of everything being, for a while everything was really cheap and easy to get, but now as everything is moving away from globalization and moving towards localization, we're starting to see artisanal stuff come back. It'll be more expensive, but it'll be better quality, and you'll have some kind of local connection to that. And I do wonder if that's going to happen with social media and content creation, because it seems like people want authenticity. Because I don't know, because I've talked to other people about this, so I feel like, at least to me, like AI, the artists and writers, unless you're like really, really bottom of the barrel, just churning out slop as quick as you can, I think in some ways that'll be the safest, because you're going to want something that has some authentic humanity to it. But I don't know, it feels like, and you probably have a much better idea of this, that as a social media content creator personality, people want the authenticity as well as like a specific worldview. At least that's why I enjoy your work. But I also like enjoy and respect that you seem to have a good, at least from what I've seen, like good sense of boundaries of like, this is my work that I do, and you have your private life. And I don't really want to be like a professional content creator. I just kind of do this as a hobby, but I very specifically kind of put myself in that mold of like, okay, this is Prester John is obviously not my real name. This is almost like a character that I'm playing, that I, will play up certain aspects and other different things that I'm interested in, but also like try to keep a very strong dividing line. So I guess I'll be interested to see how that goes, because it feels like people want that authenticity. But at that same time, it feels like when you're talking about cancel culture, these are things that like, it seems like it's only a matter of time till it blows up in your face when you're cultivating a specific audience or a specific
Yeah, I
cultural milieu.
I agree with you on the authenticity thing. I was talking to a creator who's eh, not a lot bigger than me, but is like slightly like ahead of me in metrics. And they were like, what would really like help boost your stuff is if you wrote personal essays and like, revealed more about your personal life. And I've revealed a lot of, there's like librarians of my discontent all over the internet, unfortunately. But I'm just like, I have no interest in writing like the authentic, heartfelt, uh, you know, here's how I almost, went on a date with so and so, and whatever
Mhm.
topic of the day that makes a piece go viral. Um, but I do think that like that's what people want right now, because that's like something that like the imperfections that are inherent in that confessional form is like what AI really can't convincingly replicate. I think AI is a lot better at different types of writing than people are willing to give it credit for, because it's scary. I mean, it scares me a
Mhm.
lot, you know. Um, there was a young woman who published an AI essay just sort of to make a point about orality and literacy, and it wasn't empty. It wasn't perfect, right? And I think,
Mhm.
but it would have been like a knockout piece with like, you know, a human hand editing it. Um, and that's scary. That's really scary. But what it can't do convincingly is like, be worst boyfriend ever, right? Who,
Mhm.
this sort of this weird sex writer is trying to do a kind of early 2000s manosphere type a sexual travelogue in the spirit of I think his direct influence is like Delicious Tacos, um who writes about sex tourism in the Philippines and all the girls he fucks and blah blah blah. um but like as you know like as dime a dozen, right? That kind of writing
Mhm.
is, it's like it suddenly feels so special and like personal and real, whereas like news, um or these more generic things are just are they're too distant. It's like they're too easy to replicate. I don't really buy when people are like, um oh well, Substack is turning into like AI LinkedIn slop. Well, it might superficially have like high metrics, but like the thing is, like, the people who are the runaway successes on Substack are writing about their their inner world in a really personal way. Like uh Maybe Baby, of course Rainfisher Kwan, who's sort of like the breakout like queen of Substack. Cartoons hate her. Yeah, all these women, it's no surprise that a lot of them are women, who are, and because it's so intimate, and like you could be friends with all of these women. And that's really, it's doing what podcasts did.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that we're seeing in the age of like AI and hypermedia connection, streaming, all this other different stuff, the blog is making a comeback. And I think there's something, again, not unlike radio, about the medium that makes you engage with it in a different way.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, I think people are a little bit too doomer about media. Because the other thing is, there's two audiences, like broad strokes, um, that you can get, like, eh, build on a blog, and that's the very young and the very old. I've noticed like the people who are most successful, their comments are either filled with like baby boomers, um, or people in their early 20s. And I think that, I don't know, I think there's something valuable about that insight.
Yeah, it's I think there's definitely something there for sure. And maybe it speaks to something of, people on the downturn versus upturn, or maybe most people in their 30s and 40s have other shit going on. I'm not quite sure, but it's definitely an interesting time. And Substack seems to be an interesting platform. It's become kind of, cliche to, a glaze Substack, as the kids are saying these days. But I mean, I think with any of these things, it's easy to curate your own feed. It's easy to, put as much or as little of it as you would like to into it. Um, and I think it'll be, you can, it's almost like, it reminds me a little bit of the very early days of blog, because if you don't want to do, notes, you don't have to. You can just, like, follow the blogs that you like.
Yeah, I think so too. It is a very like early blogosphere, and it's like the turnover rate is kind of the same too, because there's in the blogosphere there was like waves of people coming in and then dropping out, and there's the same kind of like mysteries, and there's the only thing that's really different about it, of course, is the monetization, which was very
Yeah.
difficult, very difficult back in the early days.
Yeah, which is a blessing and a curse, since it seems like it's nice to be able to make some money off of it, but it seems like, people will feel like, they own a part of you, or like that you can't stray outside of, what originally attracted them to you and your writing or videos or your podcast or whatever it is. So it seems like it's a little bit of a double-edged sword at times.
Do you find that your Substack audience is possessive of you?
Um, I don't know if I have a large enough audience, so to speak. So far, like, I'm a little over 1,000. From what I've seen, I get, decent numbers and engagement for the size that I'm at. But I also very specifically don't put too much of myself into it. And I very specifically try to make sure that there's distance. And not to be I'm not trying to be a dick to people. But I have seen that happen to other creators I like. I don't know if you follow somebody like Lindsay Ellis, who I used to really like her work, but it seems like her audience drove her crazy. And I've just
Yeah.
seen that, and because to me, like, I'm just doing this for fun. It's a nice hobby. Like, I started writing about a year ago. I'm no mega star by any means, but I get pretty, for my size, decently, consistently good views, for the size of a creator that I am. I do it at my own pace and it's fun. I do worry about, if it were to get, because I don't want to have this to ever be my career. If I got to a certain size, that could happen. And I've seen the audience capture happen. And, it seems like it wouldn't be fun to me at that point. Because at this point, it's fun to put things out. I get to talk to interesting people like you who I read and like, who, let's be real, if I was like, hey, Katherine, do you want to talk for an hour? Not on a podcast, you'd probably say no. And I've had really interesting conversations with YouTubers or other writers that I like. It's fun, but I very specifically try to avoid it. Like, and I had this experience a couple weeks ago where, like, I stopped for a while and then, I posted, some notes, and it got, some decent amount of traction. And just like logging in after a couple days and all of these notifications, it was just, some of it very positive, some very negative. Like, it was just emotionally just a very weird experience. And I think I want to step back from this a little bit. So I don't know. I think maybe you need to have a certain personality type, or just double down and be like, okay, this is going to be my job.
Yeah, I mean, I think also it's very different for people who are like really depending on it for an income. I think that changes their attitude. I mean, of course, right? Like, it's because then it feels so fragile and urgent to do it to do it right if it's your income. I don't think it's not my sole source of income. It is sort of it is my profession, but I make money in other ways, or like the majority of my money in other ways. Even like having the freedom to like write for other outlets, because I'm on the masthead of a couple of other outlets, and like even that is so freeing, because it's like if the I don't have to uh cater to the whims of the platform as much as like, well, I just have to make sure that these editors continue to trust me with their publication. Um, but yeah, the audience capture thing is scary. I mean, it's I won't say I haven't experienced it. I definitely have. I've definitely evolved a lot. Um, it's hard for it not to get in your head. There's one of my haters likes to say, your critics are always right. And for all I disagree with this woman, I think that's actually a really good insight. And I think that's what makes being a semi-public figure, or I guess somebody with an audience, right? That's what makes being on social media so hard. Forget this being in the content creation racket. Um, it, it's not that people are just saying random mean shit that isn't connected to you. It's like there's a kernel of truth in every hateful comment. And that is really scary. And that's something that I don't think a lot of people want to admit. And there's something very difficult about it, admitting that, or like it feels self-deprecating or something. But I do think it's true. The importance and the valence, right, is that, that's variable, right? Like like people will say that I change my mind too much, and the way they say it is that I'm spineless, right? And it's like, well, that's true, but like, is it important in the way that they're saying it's important? I don't know. I mean, I happen to think it isn't, but they are pointing out something like real about my character. Like I have flip-flopped on certain things. I've my content's really changed. My positions have changed. I've grown in public. And but that's true of, I'm just using myself as an example to illustrate the point, but that's true of everyone. And I think that can really get in your head and really negatively impact people.
Yeah, I can imagine. You're only as good as, your most recent good or bad comment, and it can stick with you. I pretty much try to like not read the negative stuff. I mean, I don't think I'm, a large enough account for most people to care, but it seems like it would be a very difficult thing when you get to a certain size. Since I noticed, like, even after I grew to an order of magnitude, after when I first started doing this, it not that many people read what I have, but it's growing, and like, I get the point. I guess what I'm trying to get at is like, you originally start writing for a specific audience, and then once it gets outside of the scope of that specific audience, then it can kind of get weird and uncomfortable. And then you're right, people can read the other things you said and try to like use it against you. And I don't know, it's something that it feels like it's a very difficult line to walk.
Yeah, needless to say, I agree.
Mm-hmm. But we're coming to the end of our time then. If you still want to keep it close to an hour, I really appreciate you coming on, by the way. This was a lot of fun. I had a lot of different notes and I was going to go in different directions, but I'm glad it went the direction it did, because this was I didn't expect to talk about Jacques Vallée and stuff like that. But so do you have any plugs, promotions, anything coming out that you want to tell everybody about?
Yeah, there's a few things going on. I'm going to be at Less Online, and I guess anyone who's listening to this and also going to that, it's the weekend that this podcast comes out. I am also giving a talk at MoMA on June 10th about fictosexuality. And then if you really want to see me in person, I will also be at the 10th International Congress for Love and Sex with Robots, also talking about fictosexuality. It's excuse me, I'm going to be presenting a paper called On Claude 9 about people who fell in love with Claude specifically. And so, yeah, that's other than that, if you're like, who is this woman and why is she trying to get us to meet her IRL, you could follow me at default.blog or default_friend on X.
Cool. Well, Katherine, I just have one last question that I always like to end with, since we can always get into the doom and gloom or some of the weird stuff, but what's something that makes you feel hopeful or interested in the future? What's something that would make you?
It's a good question. You seeing how I take my son to this like weird class on Saturdays, where it's just like open play, and then like there's a portion of it where like the toddlers make bread. It's really interesting. But seeing how curious and like alive, for lack of a better word, and engaged these very young children are, makes me think like people are way too hard on Gen Alpha. They're going to be okay.
Well, that's a great reason to be hopeful for the future. Well, Catherine, I really appreciate you coming on. This is a lot of fun, and everybody in the audience, if you're not already, please go ahead and subscribe to the show. Always has something interesting to say. Thank you.